Twice he shouts. Tourists messed with the wrong king's guard. Tourists from around the world flocked to the most famous landmarks of the city, Big Ben, the London Eye, and of course, Buckingham Palace. The Grand Palace stood tall and majestic, its white stone walls gleaming in the early sunlight, offering a promise of royal history, tradition, and power. Among the crowd of visitors was a lone tourist, a young man named Jake. He had always dreamed of seeing Buckingham Palace in person. After all, it was one of the most iconic places in the world. With his camera in hand, he was ready to capture the beauty of the palace and make lasting memories. He wasn't new to traveling. In fact, Jake had been to many places across Europe, but today felt different. Today, he was standing in front of a symbol of royal greatness, and for him, it felt magical. As Jake walked through the grand gates, he was in awe of the sheer scale of the palace. The green lawns stretched out in front of him, well-kept and pristine. The sound of a soft breeze rustling through the trees mixed with the distant voices of other tourists. He stopped for a moment to take in the view. It was a picture-perfect day, the kind that travelers often dream about when they imagine visiting a place like Buckingham Palace. But what caught Jake's attention was something entirely different. As he looked toward the front of the palace, he saw them, several tall, imposing figures standing perfectly still. They were the king's guard, known for their ceremonial role and their unwavering discipline. Dressed in their iconic red uniforms with gold buttons, and wearing the tall black bearskin hats that made them instantly recognizable, the guards stood like statues. Their stoic faces were hard to read as they stared straight ahead, seemingly lost in the timeless rhythm of their duty. Jake had seen the king's guard in pictures and videos before, but seeing them in person was something else entirely. There was a quiet power about them, an unspoken authority that made the air around them seem charged. He had heard stories about how they never moved, no matter how much they were provoked by curious tourists. In that moment, Jake couldn't resist the temptation. He had to see it for himself. What would happen if someone approached them? It was a common sight at Buckingham Palace. Tourists from all over the world often tried to get a reaction from the guards. Some would wave at them, others would try to take a selfie, while a few might even make faces to get the guards to blink or flinch. But no matter what, the guards always remained unmoved. It was part of the tradition, part of their role as symbols of British history and discipline. They were meant to stand there, calm and collected, through it all. Jake was curious. He had heard that the guards would only speak if they were truly tested, if someone crossed the line. But he wasn't sure exactly where that line was. He had seen tourists walk right up to the guards, stand inches away, and even mock them, but no one seemed to face any consequences. He figured that as long as he didn't do anything too extreme, he'd be fine. After all, he was just another tourist in a long line of people taking photos and enjoying the sights of London. He walked closer to the guards, his camera still in hand. He was careful, trying not to get too close at first, just wanting to snap a few photos from a safe distance. The guard closest to him remained as still as a statue. Jake smiled to himself, amazed at how disciplined they were. But that smile didn't last long. Feeling emboldened, Jake took a few more steps. He wanted to capture a perfect shot, one that would show the guards in their full ceremonial glory. So he edged a little closer, just enough to get a better angle. The guard, as usual, didn't move an inch. His eyes were focused straight ahead, his posture perfect. Jake could sense that the guard was aware of his presence, but the man didn't flinch. There was something about the scene that fascinated him, the stillness, the silence, the way the guard seemed so perfectly in control of himself. With a laugh, Jake stepped even closer. The guard's eyes didn't even seem to acknowledge him. It was as if Jake didn't exist in the guard's world. Jake couldn't help but chuckle softly. He'd heard that the guards could be provoked, but he'd never seen it happen. He had no idea what the rules were or if there even were any. Surely, he wasn't doing anything wrong. He was just a tourist trying to capture a moment. Then, Jake made a decision that would change the course of his visit to Buckingham Palace. He moved right up to the guard and stopped just a few feet away from him. His camera clicked, capturing the shot, but that wasn't enough. He wasn't done yet. As Jake adjusted his camera, he noticed something, an opportunity for a little fun. Without thinking too much, he decided to make a face at the guard, an exaggerated, playful expression. He stuck out his tongue and raised his eyebrows, imitating the serious, stone-faced look of the guard. He thought it would be hilarious to see if the guard would react, if he could get him to break his serious expression. At first, nothing happened. The guard didn't move, didn't blink, didn't even acknowledge the antics. Jake took that as a challenge. He moved a little closer, this time going even further with his actions. He puffed out his cheeks, crossed his eyes, and pulled an even sillier face. The crowd around him began to giggle, seeing the harmless fun Jake was having. For a moment, it seemed like nothing would happen, just another tourist, another silly gesture in a long history of attempted provocations. But then, something changed. The air seemed to shift. The guard's expression remained unchanged, but his posture became even more rigid. Jake didn't notice at first, too focused on his own antics to realize that he was testing the limits of the guard's patience. It wasn't until he heard a voice, loud, sharp, and commanding, that he realized things were about to take a different turn. "Move back!" The shout rang out across the courtyard, and the sound of it startled Jake. It was not what he had expected. He had thought the guard would remain silent, unmoved by his antics as they always did. But this time, there was an edge to the voice. It was clear that the guard was not amused. Jake froze for a moment, his face going pale. He hadn't expected the guard to speak, let alone shout. The tourists around him went quiet, sensing that something had gone wrong. Jake's heart skipped a beat. The shout came so suddenly, and the way it cut through the air felt like an electric shock. For a moment, he stood frozen in place, unsure of what had just happened. The camera hung loosely from his neck as he turned slowly to face the king's guard, the very man he had been teasing just moments before. He saw no sign of apology or regret in the guard's face. Instead, the man stood even taller, his posture even more rigid, like an immovable pillar in a storm. The guard's expression remained as stiff and unyielding as before, but there was something unmistakably intense about him now. The shout had been loud, authoritative, and undeniably serious. It wasn't a warning or a light reprimand. It felt like a command, a declaration that Jake had crossed some invisible line. The crowd around them began to murmur, their whispers growing louder as tourists stepped back slightly, sensing the sudden shift in the mood. Jake blinked, still processing what had just happened. Was he in trouble? Had he really done something wrong? For a second, he even wondered if the guard might call for backup or something. But Jake wasn't ready to back down. He wasn't scared, not exactly. He had come to London looking for adventure, looking to capture moments he could brag about later. He'd heard stories about the king's guard and how they were unflinching and always stood their ground, but he had never really believed it. It was just a story, a myth shared among travelers. Surely they were just following orders, right? They couldn't really take things this seriously, could they? "Move back!" The shout came again, this time sharper, more forceful. The guard's eyes never left Jake, and in those eyes there was no sign of warmth or amusement. It was pure discipline, as if the guard was trained to block out everything around him and focus solely on his duty. And right now, Jake was very much part of what he needed to block out. Jake's body tensed, and for a split second, he felt a wave of embarrassment wash over him. He could see the others around him now, their eyes wide, some staring with surprise, others looking with a hint of amusement. But no one dared to speak. It was as if the crowd collectively understood that something serious was unfolding. Jake shifted on his feet, realizing that he had pushed his luck too far. The guard hadn't flinched at all, not even when Jake had made faces directly at him. But the shouts were different. They weren't like the teasing comments or laughter from the crowd. These were commands, loud and direct, demanding compliance. The atmosphere around him seemed to change as if the entire space had just become heavier. For the first time since he had stepped up to the guard, Jake felt a wave of uncertainty. He had thought of this whole situation as a game, a little harmless fun for himself and the crowd. But this wasn't a game anymore. The guard wasn't some performer for tourists to poke fun at. He was there with a serious purpose, a purpose that wasn't about playing along with jokes or gestures. This was about duty, respect, and discipline, none of which Jake had understood until now. He glanced quickly around, hoping someone might intervene or give him a signal that this wasn't as serious as it seemed. But no one did. The other tourists were quiet now, their laughter gone, replaced by a growing tension in the air. Some of them had even taken a few steps back, sensing that Jake's actions had crossed a line that shouldn't have been crossed. It was like a ripple had gone through the crowd, and the energy had shifted entirely. The playful mood that had once filled the air now felt out of place. Jake, feeling a knot form in his stomach, began to slowly back away. He wasn't sure if the guard would shout again or if he would be asked to leave the area. He hadn't expected this kind of response. His hands instinctively tightened around his camera, and he moved a step back, his feet shuffling awkwardly on the stone pavement. But just as he thought he could escape the tension, the guard spoke again. This time, it wasn't a shout, but his voice was still clear and strong. "Do not come closer again," the guard said, his words heavy and deliberate, the authority behind them undeniable. There was no kindness in the tone, no invitation for negotiation. The words hung in the air like a decree. Jake's mouth went dry. He had never heard a voice so firm, so unyielding. It wasn't just a man speaking, it was the embodiment of authority. "Okay, I'm sorry," Jake muttered, almost to himself, but the words barely escaped his lips. He wasn't sure if the guard heard him, or if the words were meant for the crowd, or even for himself. The apology felt hollow, though. He wasn't sure if it would make any difference now. He had already crossed the line, and the guard's stern gaze had already made it clear that any further missteps wouldn't be tolerated. Jake felt heat rise to his face. It wasn't just embarrassment anymore. He was starting to realize the gravity of what he had done, and he knew that the guard was just doing his job, protecting the integrity of his role, his duty. The King's Guard wasn't some show for tourists, not some entertainment for those passing through. They were serious about what they did, and it wasn't about making a spectacle out of them. As Jake stepped further away, he could feel the eyes of the crowd following his every move. Some were still curious, some were amused, but most were quiet now, sensing the shift in the atmosphere. The tourists around him, who had been smiling and laughing just moments before, seemed to be reflecting on what had just happened. They had witnessed something real, something serious. The King's Guard wasn't to be messed with. Jake felt his pulse racing as he finally turned his back on the guard and started walking away. His mind was spinning, trying to piece together what had just occurred. Was he really the kind of person who needed to learn respect the hard way? Did he honestly think it was okay to make a mockery out of someone's duty? As the distance between him and the guard grew, the knot in his stomach remained. He couldn't help but wonder what had possessed him to think that this was funny in the first place. And then, just as he reached the edge of the crowd, he realized something. This wasn't just about the guard. It was about respect for tradition, for history, and for the roles people played. The King's Guard had a purpose, a duty they took seriously, and no amount of teasing or photos could change that. Jake's little act had shown him that there were lines in life that shouldn't be crossed. He had crossed one today. The crowd around him was still murmuring, but Jake didn't pay attention to them anymore. The guard's authority had made an impression on him that would stick for a long time. As Jake walked away from the guard, his mind was still buzzing. The crowd around him seemed to have returned to their usual holiday chatter, but there was an odd sense of unease in the air. It wasn't just the tension from his encounter with the guard, it was something more. He realized that the moment had shifted something inside of him. What had seemed like harmless fun only moments before now felt foolish. It was as if the quiet authority of the king's guard had shaken him, reminding him that there were things in life you just didn't mess with. The solemnity of the moment made him feel small, and he hated that feeling. He continued walking through the crowds, but his steps were slower now. He wasn't rushing to snap more photos or to find another place to explore. His thoughts kept returning to the guard, the man who had been silent, unmoving, and yet somehow in that silence had commanded more respect than Jake had ever imagined. The king's guard wasn't a part of the show for tourists. They weren't there for entertainment. They were a living symbol of the country's history, tradition, and respect. Jake had learned that the hard way, and the lesson weighed on him. It wasn't just the guard's authority that he had come up against, it was something deeper, something embedded in the very fabric of the ceremony. The king's guard had a purpose, and that purpose wasn't to amuse anyone. Their job was serious, demanding, and required discipline beyond anything Jake had ever experienced. But Jake wasn't used to feeling so small. Normally, when he traveled, he liked to be the one calling the shots. He loved exploring new cities, trying new things, and stepping outside his comfort zone. His life at home was hectic, always on the go, always in control. But here, in front of Buckingham Palace, he had learned a valuable lesson. There were places, moments, and roles that required more respect than he had ever thought to give. He had underestimated the seriousness of this duty and had paid the price. As he wandered aimlessly through the crowds, trying to shake off the discomfort, Jake noticed something. Several other tourists were still taking photos with the guard in the background, some of them laughing and joking, completely unaware of what had just happened. It made Jake feel even more foolish. How could they not see the same thing? Wasn't it obvious that something had changed in the air? He had just tested the limits and it hadn't gone well. Yet here were these people, completely oblivious to the seriousness of the situation. Jake thought about stopping and going back to apologize to the guard, but that seemed out of place now. What could he possibly say? How could he make it right? The damage had already been done. The guard's stern face and unflinching eyes were now imprinted in his mind, a symbol of everything he had misunderstood. And yet, part of him still didn't quite know how to handle the strange sense of shame that had come over him. He sat on a nearby bench, trying to compose himself. Around him, tourists continued with their visits, snapping photos, laughing, and enjoying their time at one of the most famous landmarks in the world. But Jake couldn't shake the feeling that he didn't belong in this carefree atmosphere anymore. He wasn't angry, not really, but he was frustrated, and that frustration was making him question his actions, his understanding of respect, and his need to always be in control. As he sat there, the memory of the guard's second shout echoed in his mind. It was so sharp, so clear. "Step away now," the words rang in his ears like a warning. Jake hadn't expected the situation to escalate like that. He had expected the guard to ignore him, to stay silent, or maybe even smile. But that wasn't what happened. The guard had spoken with the kind of authority Jake had never encountered before. It wasn't just the volume of the voice that struck him. It was the certainty, the confidence that Jake would listen, that Jake would follow the order without question. And the strangest part was, Jake wanted to. He didn't feel defiant anymore. He felt humbled. He stood up, still processing what had happened. The noise of the crowd around him felt distant, as if he were in a bubble, removed from everything happening. Jake glanced back toward the area where the guard had been standing. The guard was still there, his back straight, his eyes forward, unchanged. It was almost as if the moment had never happened. He had gone back to his silent watch, standing tall and unwavering. Jake found himself walking back toward the area, unsure of what he was doing. He wasn't sure if it was out of guilt, curiosity, or something else. But before he knew it, he was once again standing at the edge of the crowd, a few yards away from the guard. The scene looked the same as it had before, but something had shifted. The seriousness of the guard's duty now felt very real to him. He wasn't just looking at a man in a uniform anymore. He was looking at someone performing a job with incredible dedication and discipline. The air around the guard felt different now, like the space itself had become charged with purpose. Jake realized he had made a mistake, not just with his actions but with his understanding. He had thought that the guard was part of the show, that he was there to entertain. But in reality, the guard was a symbol of history, of tradition, and of respect. That was something Jake had failed to recognize at first, and now he understood that all too well. As the realization settled in, Jake felt a mix of admiration and embarrassment. He had tested the guard's patience, and while the man had reacted firmly, there was still a quiet dignity in the way he carried himself. The guard didn't shout anymore, didn't make any more noise. He simply stood there, doing his job, as if the entire world could fade away and he would still be there, standing watch over the history that had brought him here. Jake's gaze lingered on the guard for a few moments before he turned away, feeling like the right thing to do was to walk away in silence. This time, it wasn't because he was afraid, but because he understood. The lesson had been learned, though it had come at a cost. He had been reminded of something he'd forgotten. There was a time and place for humor, for lightheartedness, but there were also moments when respect had to take priority. The King's Guard wasn't here for him to laugh at. They weren't performers. They were living symbols of something far greater than his little joke. As he left the area for the day, Jake's steps felt different. They were slower, more thoughtful. He wasn't rushing to the next attraction or searching for the next photo opportunity. Instead, he was thinking about what he had just learned, a lesson about respect, humility, and understanding the value of silence and discipline. And for the first time in a long while, Jake felt truly reflective, grateful for the experience, and in some strange way ready to grow from it. As the day stretched on, Jake found himself walking through the busy streets of London, but his mind wasn't really on the sights or sounds around him. His feet moved almost on their own, taking him through the crowds, but his thoughts remained fixed on one thing: the King's Guard. That encounter had changed something in him. Before, he had been just another tourist, snapping photos, making jokes, and enjoying the thrill of being in a new city. But now, he felt like he had crossed a line he hadn't even known was there. Jake stopped at a street corner and looked out over the busy intersection. Cars honked, pedestrians hurried past, and the noise of the city filled the air. But none of it felt as important as what he had learned at Buckingham Palace. The encounter with the guard had humbled him in a way he hadn't expected. He had come to London with a sense of confidence, believing that he could navigate the city without a care. But now, he realized that there were things in life that demanded more than just a carefree attitude. Some things needed to be respected, and the guard had shown him that. As he walked along the River Thames, the city skyline in the distance, Jake couldn't stop thinking about the silence of the guard, that unshakable stillness. It wasn't just about the uniform or the ceremonial role, it was about discipline, about maintaining composure no matter what. The King's Guard wasn't there to entertain tourists. They weren't standing still for anyone's amusement. They had a responsibility, a duty, and they carried it out without question. Jake knew that now. He understood that his earlier actions had been thoughtless. He hadn't been trying to disrespect the guard, but in his quest for excitement, he had forgotten one important thing: not everything in life was a joke. Some things were serious, even if they didn't seem like it at first. The guard had reminded him of that, not with anger or frustration, but with a simple, direct command. It was like a wake-up call, a moment of clarity. He took a deep breath, letting the cool air fill his lungs. It wasn't that he had meant to make light of the guard's role. It was that he hadn't fully understood it. In his rush to get a laugh, he hadn't considered the depth of what it meant to stand watch over a place like Buckingham Palace. To be part of something that had existed for centuries, carrying the weight of tradition and history on his shoulders. Jake hadn't seen that at first, but now, as he thought back on the encounter, he saw it clearly. The guard's shout still echoed in his mind. "Move back," the authority in that voice. It wasn't just a warning, it was a statement. A clear reminder that some things couldn't be taken lightly. He had felt the intensity of that moment, and it wasn't something he would easily forget. But it wasn't just the shout that stayed with him. It was the guard's entire demeanor. The way he stood, unmoving and unflinching. The way he had refused to engage in the usual games tourists played with him. Jake had expected some sort of interaction, some kind of reaction to his antics. Instead, he got silence, and that silence spoke volumes. The guard didn't need to say much. His presence alone commanded respect, and that was something Jake had never fully appreciated before. Jake continued walking along the riverbank, his thoughts drifting back to the guard. He imagined what it must be like to live such a disciplined life, to stand for hours in a place like Buckingham Palace, knowing that your every movement would be scrutinized. He thought about the patience it took, the mental strength required to stay still, to keep your mind focused on the task at hand, no matter how much the world around you changed. The guard wasn't just standing there out of obligation. He was performing a role, a vital role, and doing so with unwavering dedication. In many ways, the guard had shown Jake what true commitment looked like. It wasn't flashy or loud. It didn't demand attention or applause. It was quiet, steadfast, and determined. Jake realized that he had taken those things for granted. He had always thought that commitment meant being loud, being noticed. But the guard had shown him that sometimes the strongest kind of commitment was the one that went unnoticed, the one that required the most patience and the most strength. Jake didn't feel angry with the guard. If anything, he felt grateful. Grateful for the lesson, for the way the guard had forced him to confront his own assumptions about life. Jake had thought of himself as someone who could handle any situation, someone who could laugh and joke his way through anything. But now he understood that there were times when humor wasn't the answer. Sometimes silence was more powerful. Sometimes discipline was what was needed. As Jake walked through the bustling streets, he found himself looking at the world in a different light. The things he had once taken for granted now seemed more significant. He looked at the people around him, their movements, their expressions, and he realized how much of life was about paying attention, about respecting what was around you. It wasn't about forcing a moment or making it into something it was. It was about recognizing the value in things that didn't need to be explained or understood. Just like the king's guard, some things in life stood on their own, without needing validation from anyone else. By the time he reached the famous Tower of London, Jake felt like a different person. The day had unfolded in unexpected ways, and though it had started with a simple visit to a tourist spot, it had become a moment of personal growth. He could see now that his own actions had been thoughtless, but that didn't mean the day had been wasted. On the contrary, he felt like he had learned something important, something that would stick with him for a long time. The feeling of humility and respect had taken root in his heart, and it was something he could carry forward, not just in his travels, but in his life as a whole. The Tower of London was impressive, of course. But this time, Jake didn't look at it with the same careless excitement he had felt earlier. This time, he understood that some things deserved reverence, that history and tradition weren't just things to be admired from a distance. They were things to be respected, things that could teach you valuable lessons if you took the time to truly see them for what they were. As he stood in front of the tower, Jake felt a quiet pride in himself. It wasn't the kind of pride that came from making people laugh or being the center of attention. It was the kind that came from learning, from growing, from understanding something deeper. He had made a mistake, yes, but he had also corrected it. And that in itself was a lesson worth learning. The following days in London were filled with a new sense of awareness for Jake. The city that had once felt like a playground, a place for jokes and fun, now felt different. Each step he took through its bustling streets carried a quiet weight, a deeper understanding of the world around him. As he continued exploring the iconic landmarks and hidden corners of the city, he found himself seeing things he had missed before. Where once he had been focused on capturing perfect photos and seeking out exciting stories, he now paid attention to the quieter, more meaningful aspects of the places he visited. Jake's reflection on the King's Guard never fully left him. Every time he passed a soldier in uniform or saw someone standing still with purpose, his mind would wander back to that moment at Buckingham Palace. It had seemed like such a small incident at the time, just a bit of fun, a harmless joke, but the impact it had on him was profound. It had taught him a valuable lesson about respect, discipline, and the importance of understanding the roles people play in the world. As the days went by, Jake's thoughts turned inward. He realized that he had often approached life with a kind of carelessness, never fully considering the consequences of his actions. He had moved from one experience to the next, always seeking the next thrill, the next laugh, without taking the time to understand the deeper meaning behind the things he encountered. Now, as he walked the streets of London, he felt a quiet responsibility to respect the world around him more deeply. He had begun to understand that not everything needed to be seen through the lens of entertainment or fun. Some moments, some people, and some experiences were about honoring something larger than oneself. It wasn't just the King's Guard that had taught him this lesson. It was the entire experience of London. The city, with its deep history and rich traditions, had a way of making Jake feel small, but not in a bad way. It was a humbling experience. The buildings, the landmarks, the quiet corners of the city all carried stories that had stood the test of time. And he realized that he had been rushing through life, trying to capture everything in a snapshot, without fully appreciating the depth of what he was seeing. London had shown him that there was beauty in stillness, in quiet moments that didn't need to be rushed or filled with noise. It wasn't long before Jake found himself back at Buckingham Palace, but this time, he wasn't there to take pictures or to try to get a reaction out of the guards. He was simply there to observe, to reflect. The crowds were still bustling around, tourists laughing and snapping photos, but Jake had learned something that couldn't be captured in a photo or shared in a social media post. It was something internal, something that had shifted in him since that day when he had come too close to the King's Guard and had been shouted at twice. As he stood at the gates of the palace, he felt a deep sense of respect for the guard he had once mocked. He wasn't just a man in uniform anymore. He was a symbol of something much larger, a symbol of discipline, of tradition, of the quiet strength that comes from doing your duty without seeking recognition or reward. The guard's role wasn't to entertain anyone or to be the subject of tourists' jokes. His job was to stand still, to remain focused, and to protect the history and tradition that had been entrusted to him. Jake understood that now. He smiled to himself as he thought about how far he had come since that day. The arrogance he had felt in the moment when he teased the guard now seemed so childish, so naive. He had learned to approach life with more humility, more understanding. And though he had made a mistake, it was a mistake that had led to growth. It wasn't about the guardsman's reaction that mattered anymore. It was about the transformation Jake had undergone because of it. As he continued to stand there, reflecting, something caught his eye. A young tourist, much like he had been, was approaching the king's guard. The crowd around him watched eagerly, waiting to see what would happen. Jake felt a strange sense of pride that he couldn't quite explain. He had learned to respect the king's guard and all they stood for, but more than that, he had learned to respect the value of quiet moments of reflection, moments that required humility and patience. The young tourist, unaware of the lesson Jake had just learned, tried to step too close to the guard, aiming for a photo. Jake's heart skipped a beat, remembering how his own actions had felt that day. He wondered if the guard would shout again, if the young tourist would experience what he had experienced. But instead of feeling anxious or hoping for some dramatic reaction, Jake felt a quiet sympathy for the tourist. He knew that the young man, like him, would eventually learn the same lesson. Maybe it wouldn't be today, maybe not tomorrow, but at some point he too would understand the value of respect and tradition. The guard didn't shout. Instead, he simply shifted his stance ever so slightly, his eyes never leaving the horizon. It was a silent message, one that didn't need words. The tourist, now aware that he had crossed a boundary, stepped back slowly, his face turning red with embarrassment. Jake smiled softly to himself, feeling a quiet sense of peace. The lesson, he realized, was one that could only be learned through experience. There was no shortcut to understanding the importance of respect. It had to be earned. As the crowd around him continued to buzz with excitement, Jake felt no rush to move on. He stayed there for a few more moments, taking in the beauty of the palace and the quiet power of the guard. He had come to appreciate the stillness, the discipline, and the history of the place. London had given him a new perspective, one that was not just about ticking off items on a tourist's checklist, but about finding meaning in the small moments, the silent moments that often went unnoticed. When Jake finally left Buckingham Palace, he felt a sense of calm that had eluded him before. He had learned to slow down, to be present, and to respect the roles that people played in the world. He no longer viewed the King's Guard as a mere tourist attraction. They were living embodiments of tradition and strength, a reminder that some things in life were worth respecting, not for their entertainment value, but for the quiet dignity they represented. The rest of Jake's trip passed in a blur, but it was different now. He was different. He approached each new experience with a new sense of respect and understanding. The lessons he had learned from that one moment at Buckingham Palace had carried him through the rest of his travels and beyond. He knew that he would never forget the lesson he had learned about discipline, respect, and humility. And no matter where life took him next, he would carry that lesson with him always.